First, to share my joy, happiness, and proudness to be here. I'm really happy to be invited by the bank team, and I would like to congratulate the bank for taking the leadership and bringing this seminar together. I think it's extremely important for many reasons, and one of the reasons I probably enjoy more being here is because I'll be contributing from the South-South perspective. I come from a very small country, and I'll go through a very short story about my country and things that it has done. And probably you have heard about Costa Rica in various venues and in different publications and reports. But I would like to share you the political process of some of the things that Costa Rica has done and why the country has been able to be in a position to really be serious on some very interesting transformational issues, particularly the move towards a low-carbon economy. But first, let me tell you, this is Costa Rica 1940. I choose this date for two purposes. That was the decade when Costa Rica abolished the army. And for us, Costa Rica, that was a kind of historical landmark. But also, in 1940, we had a country with 75% of its territory with forest. Population was just above 500,000 people, and the GDP per capita around $400. If we fast forward to 1987, we went from 75% of the country with forest to 21%. We more than doubled the population, and the GDP went threefold or fourfold. This is what probably most of the country has done in the last 20 years. They had increased income per capita. They have increased dramatically their population, and their natural capital has been lost throughout the process. But let's take a look to what happened between 1987 and 2012. During that period, we threefold the income per capita from $3,000.5 to almost $9,000 per person. But we double the size of our forest from 21% to 52% of the country, while the population doubled in size from 2.7 to 5 million people. Costa Rica has been the first of the tropical or developing nation to really understand the drivers of deforestation, direct drivers, the underlying reasons of deforestation, why, and how to address those drivers. But at that same time, a few other things happen. One very important one is that we went from 50% supply on energy from fossil fuel base to 92%. Today, 92% of the energy sources, electric sources, come from renewable energy, wind, water, and geothermal. The protected areas is a major driver of economic growth. $2.2 billion are generated by an industry that brings tourists to see nature and enjoy nature. 2.3 million people come every year. 80% of them, they want to visit the protected areas and take a look to biodiversity in Costa Rica. During that same period, Costa Rica was able to really understand that the future of our economy is not based on the extractive industry, oil, gas, and mining. A couple of years ago, Congress took a very brave decision, two different decisions in two different moments. One, with 90% of congressmen to ban oil and gas drilling and exploration. And last year, it was 2011, Congress, with the support of 8 out of 9 political parties, put a ban on mining, on precious metal. So all the gold, all the silver, and any other mineral resources are going to be kept down under our ground, not because there's a strong moral and coherent value associated to nature protection. It's because the country has understood that the extractive industry is not going to be the driver for growth. It's going to be nature conservation, it's going to be investment in human resources, it's going to be in technology development. So those were the reasons that made that Costa Rica has committed to move out of the business as usual by exploiting the the non-renewable resources and really invest in renewable resources. So what were the reasons or the drivers or the political process behind this? And this is a map of GDP and forest cover, which illustrates a little bit of what I was reflecting in that map. Costa Rica's also being ranked very high on the environmental impact development. I think this is not correct because they don't really assess everything that we do or try to do. Costa Rica is doing great on what we call the green agenda. Still, we're really struggling on pollution, particularly water pollution, solid waste, and we are not far from the mean average of most of our countries. That's basically because we haven't, we went from a rural-based society to an urban society in less than 15 years. And the institutional solution for dealing with water pollution, solid waste pollution, was not properly addressed, not until now that the country is beginning to really, focus in some policies and instruments to address those issues, but still we're recognized as a leading nation in nature conservation, but also we're recognized as one of the happiest countries in the world. This is the Happy Planet Index that measures life expectancy, individual satisfaction, and the carbon footprint. So the driver for deforestation were basically development policies. No, it was not a responsibility of the logging companies or the cattle ranching companies. It was the government setting policies. Now we see them and we call them perverse incentives. Yes, the land tenure, the agrarian reform program, the credit policies, the agricultural policies, all those policies were oriented to change the landscape into forested areas, which were very rich in biodiversity, into the productive landscape. Forests were not seen as productive uses. This happened in Costa Rica in the 60s and 70s. I go all over the world in the tropics, South America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. I see the same kind of institutional landscape. I see the same policies. Most of the governments hasn't understood the values associated to protecting nature and the strategic importance of nature. So when Costa Rica began to really focus on protecting nature and reverting these processes, we found that two things were really important for us. One was it was very hard to assign monetary value to nature services. And it was tremendously difficult to really close the vicious circle of the short-term benefit outweighing long-term value. Politicians always think in the term of their, administration, 4 years. So it was very difficult to really present nature and actions to protect nature when it will take more than 4 years, which is what normally a government lasts in my country. So we began to think how we can do the shift from a non-productive or irrational way of thinking into a more rational, coherent. How can we make the best out of protecting nature? Our first challenge was associated to a principle that we developed in the late 1980s. A very bright person said we cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we use when we create them. In Costa Rica, we say we cannot solve problems by using the same institutions we use when we create them. I went to Rio 92 when I was very young, and I came out of Rio 92 very happy because there was real political will to change the path, to move towards a sustainability process. But we did that commitment. We thought that with the political commitment, the shift was going to be possible. We never changed the institutions. We never changed the institutional framework. We never did any institutional structural transformations. In Costa Rica, we learned a little bit about that, and we did something very interesting beginning in 1986 when we created the Ministry of Environment, way beyond many other countries in our region. But the Ministry of Environment in Costa Rica is very different to the ones you may see today in many other countries of the world. In Costa Rica, the Minister of Environment is the Minister of Energy, Mines, Water, and Nature Conservation. It's just one guy. Just one guy setting the policy around natural resources, not 3 or 4 different guys fighting to impose their political agenda over your nearby minister. I'll give you an example of what I mean with this. This is Central America, this is Costa Rica, 8 countries, and this is the dream, the plan of the ministers of environment. This is what we call the Mesoamerican biological corridors. 8 countries linking protected areas through biological corridors and doing great things. It's a wonderful project, 25 years long. This is the way we will protect nature, and this is the ministers of the region thinking in nature conservation. This is great. Unfortunately, at the same time, ministers of energy of the same countries, of the same region, are presenting their plans. This is power lines, dams, power plants, and many other energy projects on top the corridor in protected areas. And these are the ministers of infrastructure of the same region thinking on ports, highways, roads, whatever infrastructure, and this is urban development. These are the ministers from the same government thinking on silos. And to make it worse, the multilateral development agencies are financing the same way. The environment guys are financing the ministers of environment. The energy guys from the banks are financing the ministers of energy, and you know the whole story. I will reflect this better with an anecdote. When I was a minister of in my country within 2002 and 2006, as I was invited to a meeting of ministers of mining of Latin America. I went to Buenos Aires, Argentina. I went to a very fancy hotel where we will be having our meeting for 3 days, and we were in a big saloon, and the chairman, the Minister of Mines from Argentina, asked us to introduce ourselves. I was the last one in the table. I was the last one introducing myself, and when I introduced, something very happy happened. I said, my name is Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. I'm the Minister of Environment of Costa Rica. Dead silence in the room. Everybody looked at me as if I was a spy or an enemy or something weird. The chairman said to me in a very polite way, Mr. Minister, you are in the wrong meeting. This is a meeting of ministers of mine, not environment. I had to explain him that in Costa Rica, the Minister of Environment is the Minister of Mine at the same time. Well, they felt very bad with my presence. They treated me very unpolitely for 3 whole days. Of course, I made their life miserable, to be frank, for 3 days, telling them how wrong their political system was, whereby a Minister of Mine thinks that the Minister of Energy is an enemy. In my country, we tend to believe, and we may be naive, but we tend to believe that ministers is a political team, and we gather around a political plan behind our president, and we all work in a very very well-oiled machinery in achieving our political targets, which is the president, the one who sets the political targets. But this is the theory. In the practice, many countries of the world struggle with what I call the institutional failure. So the takeaway message at this point, based on my experience in Costa Rica, is that we won't be able to do the leap forward in terms of achieving sustainability goals and targets if we keep on having the same institutional framework that created problems. I have traveled to see countries trying to revert deforestation and investing in REDD+, reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation. And they try to achieve those targets by creating an office, high-level office on REDD+. But they still have a Minister of Environment here, a Minister of Agriculture here, a Minister of Forest here, and a Minister of many other things all over the place. With that institutional framework, it's going to be extremely difficult to make progress. The other area that we understood early on in Costa Rica is what Mr. Pachuri mentioned before. It is the market failures. Forests generate a lot of environmental services, and those environmental services are being used by somebody at the regional, national, global level, but nobody pays for those services. And there's a high cost associated to maintaining those watersheds and those forests or those tree plantations or those green activities within the landscape. So in Costa Rica, we began to understand how we can use the market in favor of the forest, so forests can have an option to compete with other land uses, cattle, pineapple, coffee, banana. Particularly in the tropics, even though you got a lot of biodiversity, a lot of sunlight, and a lot of humidity, you don't have precisely the best soils of the world. So soils are extremely fragile. So you need to be very wise in how you can develop productive activities in the tropical landscape. So we said, if we are losing forests because the value of the services that forests generate is not internalized, let's create a mechanism. And we create the payment of environmental services in the early 90s, which is a very simple program, the PES, called Payment for Environmental Services, where people are being paid for the carbon services, the water services, biodiversity, and landscape services that they provide. We were very much influenced by the Kyoto Protocol and the negotiation in UNFCCC. Costa Rica was pushing for this kind of thing at the global level. We were very unsuccessful, and we concentrate ourselves in our country. We said we need to establish a mechanism by which people are being paid for the services that forests generate to the society. So these were the environmental services that were considered in the 1996 forest law. We changed the vision and the mind of many people. Instead of seeing forests like this one, we began talking about the carbon banks. And in 1997, something very important did happen. Costa Rica put a tax on fossil fuels, 3.5%, 1997. So the environmental service is carbon fixation. Who generates the service? Those who own forests, tree plantations. Who benefits from the service? Those who use fossil fuels. So the way we conceptualize the internalization of the environmental service is through a tax on fossil fuels. This tax, 3.5%, goes to an environmental fund, which is private public, that pays those owners of forests and tree plantation for the carbon service. This is back in 1997. Back then, we didn't have a bank like you guys do have now that can tell you what is the value of a metric ton. We didn't have the economists. So we began thinking, how much are we going to pay? We don't know what is the value of a ton of carbon. Well, we knew what was the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching, and we began paying the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching, $42 per hectare per year. This is how we began this program in 1997. The payment for environmental service is what we call the second generation of forest incentives. 20 years before that, we had all kinds of forest incentives, probably the same ones you see in most of the tropical countries today: tax breaks, direct incentive subsidies. We learned those policies are unsustainable because one day the Minister of Finance won't keep on supporting those schemes because he won't see the benefits, because the accounting systems in our countries are not able to reflect those environmental services. So that was one very interesting lesson that we learned in Costa Rica. I got 5 minutes, so I began wrapping around. So let me give you some examples of how this has worked. These are charts of the areas that we paid on environmental services up to 2005. We were able to really be very successful in concentrating and focusing in key areas because of carbon and biodiversity, but also in human development. We concentrate in paying carbon services in indigenous communities, and this is one of the most successful cases I would like to reflect with you guys. These are indigenous communities in Costa Rica, and this is one, tiny. 98% of the area is old-growth tropical forest, and this is me as a minister. I had a check in my hand, $52,000. That's a public act with all the indigenous communities, and I was going to pay them for the environmental services they provide that year. But before giving the check, I asked them, why don't you show me what you did with the monies we pay you for the carbon services? And they said, well, if you want to walk a little bit more, we already walked 5 hours just to get there. They showed me 52 new homes, new school, new old road, new aqueduct. I took that picture that day, and when I took that picture of the kids, and these are the poorest of the poor in Costa Rica, indigenous communities, I said to myself, my goodness, we create this instrument, the payment for environmental services, for forest conservation, but what is the end result? The outcome is a human benefit. From that day on, we began to measure the impact of the payment of environmental services in poor communities. This is a map of where the poor people live. If you put the map of the poor people and the forested areas, exactly the same. So we began to realize that 45% of the beneficiaries for payment for carbon services are on the aim of the social programs of the government. That day, we began to concentrate and collaborate more with the central government. So this is the map of indigenous communities being paid. The red are the payments. They receive $4 million every year. $4 million. That's probably the number one source of income and revenue for indigenous communities in Costa Rica is carbon fixation. Without a global scheme, without the UNFCCC agreeing on the terms of REDD+. This is because we designed a national-based mechanism. So this is the story of carbon. We did the same thing with water. We did a payment for environmental services on top of what we were doing on carbon with water, and we developed the concept of the water factory, and we did payments, and we had so much information on where the water and the users and everything is. The water is a long story. It's kind of now a long-hanging fruit, so people are being paid $42 per hectare per year for carbon, plus $20+ for water, as any people are receiving $78 per hectare per year. But also we did something very interesting. We began moving outside of the forest and the tree plantation in the productive landscape. We found that there's a lot of environmental services outside protected areas, forested areas, and tree plantations. And we did a lot of research. Take a look to this example. This is a traditional cattle ranch in Costa Rica and in the tropics. Very poor people, degraded pasture land, very poor productivity. 12 years later of payments of environmental services, look what happened. We didn't change the productive activity, we changed the landscape by increasing biomass. So this is a good example of win-win. The farmer is being paid for carbon and water, and we have a GEF project that pays for biodiversity as well. But also, he was a winner because cows, they love shade, and they love to graze on trees. Browse on trees. This is a good example of restoration of the landscape. When we talk about nature, we talk about nature conservation, but half of the work we need to do globally is restoration because we have destroyed most of our ecosystem. This is a good example also on how we can bring together the Rio Conventions, CBD, UNFCCC, UNCCD. This is an excellent example of where we can bridge them all together. And the payment for environmental services for us has been the drivers. So we paid 700,000 hectares in Costa Rica for water, biodiversity, and carbon. It's more than $2 million, $200 million generated by the scheme in Costa Rica. 7,000 beneficiaries, 40% of them below the line of poverty. Annual budget is $30 million. 80% of those $30 million come from in-country financial mechanisms. We receive grants and other support. But let me share you, and I got a lot of information, some of the takeaway messages. Good public policies, elimination of perverse incentives, and the payment for environmental services has proven to be able to help us. Once more, we deal with the issue of institutional failures, we deal with the issue of market failures, and we've been able to really succeed. When I was a minister, and this is my last slide, I received the visit of many ministers from many countries of the world, from all over, tropical countries, and they always ask me, Mr. Minister, what can I do when I go back to my country? And I never had an answer to them. I never had a good response. So one day, I began to realize that I need to make a list. And the first thing I came as a conclusion is that, the things that made my country nicer and better are not technology improvements, are all institutional improvement. So one day I came with a list that I want to share with you. And whenever a minister asks me what are the recipe, I'll go with my recipe. The rule of law, transparency and accountability, ease of doing business, respect of private property, democratic government, impartial courts, credit, consumer regulation, welfare. I haven't talked anything about nature in my list. And this is the list of the Minister of Environment. No, this is not the list of the Minister of Finance. These are the conditions that we were able to create in Costa Rica, so we had an opportunity to achieve all those sustainability targets. Copyright, free press, education, and yes, for me, create protected areas, one of the most important ones. So I think that now that we went through this Rio Plus 20 process, I think there's a lot of great opportunities to really be able to really understand the challenges associated to the sustainability path. I think that the Rio Plus 20 process gave us a great idea and clue about the institutional framework for sustainability and the issue of markets and green accounting. Those things are extremely important, and I strongly believe that in one way or another, those were the things that Costa Rica was able to understand throughout this process. So thank you, and have a good day.